By way of introduction, Ruth Fremson, a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer with the New York Times. She joined the Times in 2000 as a staff photographer. Her assignments have included the John McCain and Al Gore presidential campaigns, and beginning in April 2002, the conflicts in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Israel. She has received 3 Pulitzer Prizes. In 2001, she was part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team of photographers whose images of 9/11 won for breaking news photography. In the same year, she was also part of a team that was awarded a Pulitzer for their coverage of the uprisings in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And in 1999, Fremson, with other members of the Associated Press, received the Pulitzer for their feature photography of images captured during the Clinton impeachment proceedings. Before joining the New York Times, Fremson previously spent 6 years as an Associated Press staff photographer, where she covered events in Jerusalem and Israel, working in Washington, covering the White House, the Atlanta Olympics, the Republican and Democratic conventions, Senator Bob Dole's presidential campaign, the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales, and the Pope's visit to Cuba. She also worked in Charlotte, North Carolina, covering the American intervention in Haiti, the Civil War in Bosnia, the Susan Smith trial, and various sporting activities. As a Washington Times staff photographer, her assignments included the fall of the Berlin Wall, communism in Czechoslovakia, Bill Clinton's first presidential campaign and inauguration. She's been honored by the National Press Photographers Association, the New York Press Photographers Association, and the White House News Photographers Association. Her journalistic career began in the summer of 1998 as an intern at the Washington Times. Good encouragement for all of you planning your summer internships. She also gained experience as a mentor for young photojournalists for 4 years in the Associated Press Diverse Visions annual workshop. A native of Long Island, New York, she received a Bachelor of Science in Graphic Design and Photography from Syracuse University, and then did graduate work in photojournalism at Ohio University. I also learned last night that she's an avid skier. I think Alta would be her preferred Utah ski resort. She's very well acquainted with our mountains and our geography here, as she also covered the 2002 Winter Olympics here in Salt Lake City. Please join us with a warm welcome for Ms. Ruth Fremson.
Makes me sound really old. Okay. There's a Chinese proverb that says, "Don't listen to what they say, go see." And this is what most journalists do. Often going to see means going to areas of conflict. And as Corey just told you, I've covered a number of conflicts during the course of my career, which actually started in '88. I think that was a typo there, Corey. I've documented the military's reinstatement of Haitian President Aristide more than 10 years ago, covered the NATO occupation of Bosnia and Kosovo, and more recently the war in Iraq. For the past decade, I've been following the seemingly endless and always simmering Palestinian-Israeli story. After following conflict situations, a rhythm begins to reveal itself. As odd as it sounds, there really is a loose cycle to conflict, and the stages of it are a diplomacy phase, trying to avoid a conflict. Then we have hostilities, which includes death, destruction, and carnage. There's the displaced people and refugees. Then it's followed by victory and or defeat. And then revenge, reprisals, and the return of exiles, including politicians. And finally, peacekeepers and reconstruction. So where does photojournalism fit into all these cycles? Photojournalism is a visual language. Sometimes one photo really is worth 1,000 words and needs no other explanation. Photography can enhance a story and deepen the reader's understanding of it. It's an effective and universal method of communication that adds content to any news report. You can find yourself faced with a foreign language newspaper, one in Chinese or Spanish or so on, but there's no need for verbal skills to understand images. In The Power of Photography, Vicki Goldberg writes, "Chief among its powers is evidence and authentication. Even today, when an audience supposedly knows that photographs lie, the most sophisticated observers instinctively believe the camera's report. One should remember, too, that photos don't lie, but only precisely say what the camera sees. If the subject is a deliberate falsehood, such as a dead man propped up to look alive, the photo is still a meticulous witness of what was before the lens." As photographer Lewis Hines said, "Photographs don't lie, but liars may photograph." Still, acting as a witness is what photography can do best. The first war that Americans experienced was the Civil War, and it arrived in a delayed manner but still it was unprecedented. It intensified the experience of conflict far from the battlefield. During the Civil War, about 300 photographers were authorized to take their cameras to the front lines. The photographs went on exhibit within a month after the battle and were distributed in quantity within another month. This time lapse seems ludicrous to us today, but in the age of live television, but then it was a remarkable thing. Matthew Brady was a photographer who saw the possibilities for war photography before others did. He received authorization from the government, but not employment, to go to the front. He decided that the potential profit was worth the risk of paying his own way. And it wasn't without danger. He almost lost his life during the Battle of Bull Run when his darkroom wagon got caught in the crossfire. During the war, he made as much as $12,000 a year from the sale of his photographs, but after the war he went bankrupt. It's because of his work, though, and other photographers who followed in his footsteps that there is a shared common experience. In the 1920s and 1930s, people began to expect their information to arrive in a visual form. Vicki Goldberg again points out in The Power of Photography, those who have never been in a war zone share memories of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam with the men who fought the battles. We know how a flag was raised in victory, how a prisoner was shot at point-blank range in Saigon. But photographs can't change things by themselves. They're dependent on words, circumstances, distribution, and belief systems. They only have power if the right people see it in the right context at the right time. And a perfect example of that dates to World War II. When Allied forces liberated the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, photographs conveyed the full extent of the horrors far more convincingly than the words did. It's a curious fact that in 1945, the first written accounts of the camps had seemed to people as not entirely truthful. In 1942, before photographs had come out of Germany, there were original eyewitness reports of gas chambers and concentration camps. These reports in newspapers were actually greeted with suspicion. It wasn't until the newspapers published photos of the camps, usually on the inside pages, that these images forced people to accept the enormity of the Nazi war crimes. As technology changed and made it easier and cheaper to gather news, television became a driving force in the dissemination of news, and the result is a visual and audible assault on our senses. We're inundated with images, bombarded by billboards, print media, internet, and the television. Recent conflicts have not produced the international impact in the same way that Eddie Adams' Vietnam War photo of the execution of the prisoner in Saigon did. Partially, this is due to television. Experiencing the news has shifted from the printed page to the small screen. The Palestinian intifadas, the Eastern European uprisings, the Chinese student demonstrations, the 1991 Gulf War, and the war in Iraq were primarily television experiences. Wars can be fought now with long-range missiles, and these make graphic images of tracers, but little else. There are less outlets for photographs to be distributed. Life and Look magazines, which ran in-depth photo essays, are gone. News magazines are using less news and more celebrity stories. These take the space that photojournalism once had. Coverage these days is so heavy that it can amount to overkill, and overkill can also work against television a bit. But still, if television does not have a moment of maximum intensity, it loses little, whereas the still images lose everything. A picture worth 1,000 words relies on the circumstances and the ability of the photographer to recognize and translate in a fraction of a second a critical moment in time that speaks volumes. When a horde of photographers and television crews converge on a scene, that chance that one will have something more profound and startling than the next is diminished. As photography and television bombards us, we tune out. We're saturated and we shut off. What continues to amaze me, however, though, is that people complain about the media being negative, that the news is only bad, and that they're sick and tired of death and destruction that they can't get away from in their morning papers or their nightly news. And yet, they seek this very thing out in the form of entertainment, in Hollywood films like Rambo, Independence Day, Syriana, When a Stranger Calls. In the face of these obstacles and restrictions, photojournalism and documentary photography has become ever more individual and daring. When photographers can afford it, they follow a subject for an extended period of time, reporting more in depth than television can. They experiment boldly with color, light, composition, and angle. The more innovative work gets reproduced in books and shown in exhibitions, but is less often published in most daily newspapers and magazines. So photojournalism finds itself in an odd paradoxical state today. Some of the best of it may be more readily viewed in a museum than in a newspaper. Television, which is securely placed at the center of news communication, has neither the need nor the opportunity to be so aesthetically inventive. As Vicki Goldberg says, still photography has not lost its power, but some of its glory. The issue now is not whether television or the internet will become the primary source for news, but how the world will regard photographic imagery in general now that there are so many reasons to distrust it. Everyone these days has a digital camera and a computer with some form of photo software, but most lack the training in the ethics of photojournalism. Therefore, everyone knows how easy it is to put Aunt Sally's head on Uncle Bob's body. Because of this, the veracity of the image is undermined on every front. Where you, the audience, the public, and the reader, will relocate your trust is a question. The belief in images remains very strong. We have a well-founded tendency to believe what we see, and this is what gave photography its power in the first place. Lack of interest is more dangerous. Perhaps becoming better news consumers will help. We don't make important purchases without researching several choices and sources, so why would we pick one news source and use only one as our Bible for what is going on in our communities and our world? As news gathering and dissemination evolves, we in the media have to evolve as well in order to remain viable. And in a time when printed space is very valuable real estate, photographers are exploring all avenues for visual information. The New York Times website has turned out to be a great venue and home for some of our work. There's limitless space, and the ability to blend images with words and sound and video can enhance the overall coverage of a story. That said, I would not want to give up the daily experience of reading a newspaper. Even if I don't read every word, I scan everything and I find things I would have never clicked on the website. And I think I'm much richer for that. So, getting back to hotspots and images and how we at the New York Times have handled them, let's look at some photos. So covering a conflict is an ongoing event. It's never a 9-to-5 job, but one of complete immersion. Every day the newspaper adds an installment of the story. On the ground, we have to think about what we ran yesterday and how we can further the story tomorrow, and think about how we can deepen the reader's understanding of the subject. What we see here, the first few images are from the Balkans, and I'm going to try to slide this over. Do this at the same time. This picture was taken in Kosovo in 1999, and it was some children following American soldiers on patrol. It was a fairly quiet time, and we were putting out daily photos of what the troops were doing over there. And this was just a lovely moment of, what is war for childhood, whereas children grow up and want to be soldiers, but then the reality of war is actually never a pretty thing. So this is from Bosnia, and as I talked about the cycles of conflict, again, we have the death and destruction. This is a mother at the grave of her son. And these are some refugees being forced out of their homes. This is the return of Herman Rugova, who recently passed away in Kosovo after NATO came in and began the peacekeeping mission. This is a gypsy woman whose house was set on fire because people had blamed her for helping the Serbs against the Albanians early on in the conflict. And then finally the peacekeeping mission once again as American soldiers on patrol in Kosovo, and some women watching the patrol. Okay, so we move here to the destruction of the World Trade Center in September 2001, which led to a long series of events and a lot of time on the road for many of us. From September 11th, 2 weeks later, I found myself in Pakistan. And we had several teams of journalists based all around Afghanistan trying to get into the country. We had several teams placed with the Northern Alliance in the north, and others of us placed all the way along the border with Pakistan, waiting until it became advantageous and safe to go into Afghanistan. And this was the day I arrived in Pakistan, and there was an anti-American demonstration, and the crowd was asked who was going to raise their hands if they wanted to go fight jihad. And pretty much everyone in the crowd raised their hands. This was another demonstration in Pakistan a few weeks later, And in this photograph, a man was lighting an American flag on fire, and in the process of it, he was a bit overeager and he caught himself on fire instead. While I was there, I was thinking about how I could come up with some kind of a project that I could work on despite the daily demonstrations that would be useful and valuable and educational. And what had struck me was the variation in head coverings among women. And I thought that this was something that might be helpful for people to understand that it's not very black and white, and there might be a way to help people understand the gray areas of Islamic dress. And so I photographed a series of women, portraits of them with their chosen attire, and we put quotes with their words saying why they dressed the way they did. This also became a web slideshow and a photographer's journal later on the website. So you had this in the Week in Review, and then if you went to the website, you saw a further look at these women with more women and more quotes. So you had this added value now between the website and the newspaper. These following images were actually taken for the New York Times Magazine, and it was an essay about a refugee camp that was housing the Afghan refugees. And many of these images didn't end up in the magazine, but they also ended up in the same web slideshow later on. So although somebody would say, well, aren't you frustrated that you only had a few pictures in the paper? The answer is really no, because they're also on the website. So, you can get something from each of them, and if you look at both, you actually have more of everything. So this was the refugee camp, and these all together made a photo essay about this place. Being a woman there, as a woman photographer, actually could be very frustrating. This is very much a man's world, but it could also be a real advantage when it came to photographing the women. This was taken in a house, in a courtyard of a house where my male colleagues were not allowed to go. But being a woman, I was welcomed there and got to see this world that half of my colleagues weren't able to. This is a woman who had fled the bombing in Jalalabad with her family of 11. She was pregnant and she went into labor on the back of the donkey while she was leaving the country. They snuck across the border into Pakistan, into the refugee camp, and she gave birth to the baby on the left hours after she arrived. And we met her the next day. This was a situation in which there was a rumor in the camp that extra food aid was going to be given out. And there was a stampede towards a mud-walled compound where people were supposed to pick up these tokens that would allow them to get additional aid. And as the people inside the compound realized what was heading their way, they shut the gates because it had been just a rumor and they really didn't have enough for everybody. And these women who were so desperate to get food for their families started just scaling the walls and jumping over them into the courtyard in order to get the tokens. And I thought that was an incredibly dramatic moment for women who seemingly were so docile until that point. This is a common bakery in the camp, and then this is a women's clinic. Here we have Kofi Annan. This is right before the war in Iraq began, and he's listening to President Bush cite his reasons for going to war. And we find ourselves now here in Iraq. This is in northern Iraq. Again, the Times had sent numerous teams to different parts of the area. I was with a reporter named David Rode, and we were up in Turkey, and we had gotten into the northern part of Iraq through Turkey. We also had a team who had come through Iran. We had a team in Baghdad. We had a team come from Kuwait. So we were fairly well covered inside. And this photo is taken of some of the people who fled Erbil, the Kurds in the north, who were afraid that there might be chemical attacks in their cities. We were with the special forces in the north, and it turned out, by the roll of the dice, that it wasn't the most advantageous place to be for covering the biggest part of the conflict, because the war basically went south on us. There was no northern front, and everything began to be very focused down south. There were a few teams of special forces in the north that were keeping the Iraqi army engaged so as not to consolidate all their forces in the south against the troops. And these are the contrails from a B-52 after bombing in the north. This was the day that Kirkuk fell, and these Iraqi soldiers had surrendered to Kurdish forces and were very, very, very hungry. They had been on the front lines there in a very no-win situation. They told us we were either going to be killed by the bombs coming from above, or if we tried to desert, we were going to be killed by the forces behind us that were told to shoot deserters. So Human Rights Watch had actually told us at one point that these guys had been eating grass in their bunkers because there was nothing else for them in those last days of the conflict. And this is one of the many statues of the Saddam regime that were toppled. And this was on the day that Kirkuk fell as well. It was a day of liberation. And we went into the hospital in Kirkuk as we arrived to see how fierce the fighting had been. And the emergency room was full of wounded people and fighters. And I went outside for a second, and there was a cart that came screeching up to the front of the hospital. In the background, I could hear the horns blaring, the flags flying, the whistles blowing, as everyone was heading to the center of town to topple the Saddam statue. But here at the hospital was a completely different story. This woman opens up the back seat of the car and found her husband dead inside and started screaming, "Mohammed, I told you not to go out." He was a civilian and he had gotten caught in the crossfire at the very last moment. So it was quite a jarring moment of liberation on the one hand, but not for everyone, and what war could really be about. The next day, we went into Mosul, which had just fallen, and we thought we would check into this hotel, secure a room for ourselves as a base of operations. And we got there, and as you can see, this was the beginning of the looting, and they were taking everything from the hotel, including the beds that we were going to sleep on. So we ended up not staying there. It became a very dangerous city for the next week. This was outside the hospital, which became a constant flashpoint. And these are some special forces soldiers on the left working with Iraqi soldiers on the right, arresting some Kurds who had been accused of looting. On the right, you have the major who was in charge of the special forces, who was trying to win the hearts and minds, and basically he was the new sheriff in town and was trying to figure out who was in charge, what the alliances were, who the tribes were, and here he's meeting with a tribal leader. This is a sort of a routine moment. This was a routine patrol to try to find weapons. This family had thought that they could outwit the soldiers and threw their weapons into a muddy pit in their backyard, but somebody told on them, ratted them out, and they had to go get them. This is from one of the many mass graves that were discovered after the war. Most of these bundles were the remains of people that had actually disappeared after the first Gulf War, when the Kurds and the Shiites had risen up against Saddam, expecting that the Americans would not abandon them, and then were slaughtered later on. Again, this is part of the winning the hearts and minds. You know, the soldiers really have a beat, and they go on foot and they visit their same schools, same houses, same businesses daily. And in this case, this soldier was, building relationships with people at a school. And every time he went in, he sat down, he had a cup of tea. And then the story continues here on the home front. There are many stories, you see them more and more now, about returning soldiers and post-traumatic stress and the cost of war. And this is another way that we can talk about what is happening over there. This is a soldier who was receiving his leg. This was the first day he got his leg after he had lost it over there. I was in Haiti. This picture is from Haiti. I think it's 2004, and it was the bicentennial of Haiti. And we were doing daily coverage of the bicentennial and the situation there, which is pretty dire. This woman is making cakes out of dirt. for many people there is no money for food, and they have found a certain dirt that they can get nutrients from, and they mix it with butter and salt and water, and they make these cakes out of it, and they dry it in the sun, and it's sold or it's eaten. While I was there, I had some time on my hands beyond the daily coverage, and I wanted to work on a project, and I found a shelter run by a priest that was a shelter for girls, basically girls who were on the street or orphans or people whose parents couldn't afford to feed them or send them to school. And he on his own, a 30-year-old guy, managed to raise enough money to shelter at first 15 girls, then 20, then 30, and now 45. And it was quite an inspiring place to see. He managed on his own to just come up with the money, the funds, and the place. And in a time when everybody says, what can I do? I'm just one person. I thought this was the answer. So I did a photo essay, and we wanted to run it in the newspaper, but space was tight in our foreign section, and it kept getting put off. And finally the foreign editor said to me, well, why don't you try sending it to the Week in Review section? They may have more space for it. So I talked to the Week in Review editor, and he said he would love to have it, and we planned to run it on Sunday. And then there were mudslides in Haiti, and there were hundreds that were killed in the mudslides, and they felt that it was off the news, it was the wrong time to run a story like that, and I thought the project was dead. But again, the web to the rescue, picked up the story and ran it as a photographer's journal. We got an incredible response from it, and I'll run through the photos of it. This is the kitchen. And I just, a year later, got an email from a woman in Japan who said, you probably don't remember me. I had contacted you about this shelter, and I wanted to let you know that my church has raised 2 million yen for this shelter. So that was, something incredible and a wonderful achievement for me and wonderful for the girls and for the father. And, it was one of the beauties of the work that I do. In this photo, the girls don't have mirrors, and so there was a parked car, and they were just having a blast, seeing themselves warped and, stretched out in the metal of the car, and also just seeing themselves at all. And this is the top floor where Father Pierre hopes to build his next level for more girls. It looks simple to us, but it's really something quite spectacular for Haiti. Switching now to another situation, this was a project we did about gold mining, and gold mining in the Third World, which ran in the paper as a series earlier this year, or actually the end of last year. And this story took us to Guatemala and Peru and Ghana. And one of the things that's interesting about this isn't particularly a hotspot, except it's the kind of issue that can turn a place into a hotspot. You have a large corporation going into a third world country that needs development and has all the best intentions. The government is perfectly happy to allow them to come in, do what they want. And then what happens is populations on the ground get displaced, and even with the best intentions of sustained development, problems arise because often a corporation will only be there for a certain amount of time, a mine only has a certain amount of gold, and then they leave. And then the people who are displaced are still displaced. The people who didn't quite make the transition are left hanging. So this is in Ghana, basically, where a new mine is going to start operation soon, and this is an area of land that has been cleared for that mine. This is an artisanal miner who's an old-style miner who's actually mining illegally in the toxic waste dump from an old mine because this is the only job that they have. And so there's resentment builds there against the new mine coming in because the mine is cracking down on the artisanal miners. This is again in Ghana. These guys are basically mining in toxic waste dumps, the old tilings, from a previous mine. And then they get angry at the new mine because they feel like they're not being treated legitimately. This is in Guatemala, another place where a gold mine has gone into, and at one point the mine, in order to get a piece of equipment through, took down a footbridge that was over a road that the people had built. And people were very upset by this and started protesting and rioting, and in the course of it, one person was killed. So this is how hotspots can develop. In this picture, you have a referendum going on in a small village in Guatemala, which was opposed to the mine, but felt that they hadn't been asked about it. So in order to just make their point, they held a referendum despite the fact that they knew that they probably were not going to be able to fight it. This is a leaching pad in Peru, and one thing we discovered was that it takes about 20 tons of waste to generate the amount of gold in one wedding band, which is an astonishing amount. And here you can see how the mine encroaches upon the Peruvian people. This is up in near Cajamarca. And these people were opposed to the mine, but really didn't have much say in it. To give you just an idea of the scope of it, this is a leaching pond where the solution with the ore in it would drip into a large pond. And you can tell just by the size of the men and the pipes how big that is. Bless you. These are some of the people that will be displaced by the mine. And this is the pouring of gold bars in Peru. This is at the Newmont Gold Mining Corporation. And this is a woman and her child who had actually fought against having their lands explored and were arrested for it and detained because of it. Then we went to India, actually, because India is the largest consumer of gold jewelry, to have a look at the consumption side of things. And here, this is a young man working in a jewelry factory in Delhi. And then, of course, the marketing of gold, because here is, these are women buying bangles in a jewelry store in Delhi, and jewelry is a huge part of their culture. It's women's dowry for their weddings, so you have a cycle here of necessity and waste. And here's a wedding in India. So as I said, I covered the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for many years. The first time I went there to work was in 1992, and it's just an ongoing, seemingly endless cycle. I'll just run through some of these quickly. This was a strike in East Jerusalem. This is a bus bombing near the West Bank. This is a woman who didn't know whether a family member was involved in a terrorist attack, hurt by one, I mean. This is in the hospital afterwards. This is a Palestinian in Bethlehem under curfew in 2002 when there had been a series of terrorist attacks for a month, the month of March. There was at least one a day, if not more. And in response, Israel reinvaded the West Bank and reoccupied many of the cities. This was in Bethlehem. This was also in Bethlehem, where there was a curfew imposed and nobody was supposed to be out on the streets, but this young man had gone to a store, and so the soldiers were asking him what was in his bag. This is in Jenin, where this woman's house had been destroyed, and to the right you can see the wreckage of the Jenin refugee camp. This is a Palestinian woman who was found in the rubble about a week later and rescued. This is, again, a paradise lost there a bit. And 2 years later, we went back again to the Jenin refugee camp and to see how things were now. And as you can see, this picture is taken pretty much in the same area. And this is the rebuilding. And ironically, some of the homes now that have been rebuilt for people who lost them are nicer than their original homes. So it sets up a very odd dynamic where some people are almost jealous of those who had lost their homes originally because now they have a nicer home. This is the beach in Gaza. I think this is the side of the story that we don't see very much. It's the daily life, and that there's a lot of normalcy happening despite the conflict. This was Arafat's funeral in November of 2004. The helicopter right there is the one that brought his body for burial at the Mukata compound. And again, this was people who were trying to get in to attend the funeral. This is a Palestinian funeral. This was one of the targeted hits by the Israeli army in Jenin. And then the next picture is of an Israeli funeral where a young boy was killed by a Qassam rocket that came from Gaza. This woman is actually now a member of the new parliament. She is a member of Hamas, and this is in front of her house. We took this photo a while ago. These are two of her sons who were suicide bombers. And again, so the daily coverage is what I've just showed you basically. I spent 2 months there this past summer covering the withdrawal from Gaza. And at the end of it, at the end of the daily coverage, the other photographer that I was working with, we didn't feel like we had sort of gotten it yet. We wanted to do something else. And we put together this essay, some of which is here, that we also had on the website. So there was the daily coverage, and then the website carried the daily coverage, but at the end of it there was another photographer's journal, and these photos are from that. This is the day in the largest settlement that the Israeli army came to evict Israeli settlers. And this is the beginning of some of the evictions. There was some resistance to the evictions, and so the smoke in the background is from some places burning. This is from outside the synagogue. And this is inside a home where the Israeli soldiers on the right had to break into the house to evict the family, who refused to believe that this was actually going to happen. And here was again an example of denial. This is a woman who was being told that she had to leave, and she was still doing her laundry. And these were all people who knew for a long time in advance that they were going to have to go. This is a youth that fought the soldiers and refused to leave a yeshiva where he had barricaded himself, and they had to drag them out of there. And this is another settler who, although he was put on a bus to be taken out, he was still trying to get away and stay. These are some of the young teenage girls that had barricaded themselves in a synagogue and were praying for a miracle at the last moment. And again, another youth that had been inside the synagogue who had been dragged out and was just completely exhausted at the end of it all. And finally, this is the end of a last prayer inside a house as the settler is wrapping up his prayer shawl and getting ready to leave. So that's it. I'll be happy to take any questions. I think we have 15 minutes to do so. If anybody has any. Yes?
These pictures look like they were taken under peaceful conditions, but many of them weren't. What motivates you, or well, first of all, were you in a lot of danger in some of these? And if so, what motivates you to continue such a possibly dangerous job?
There were in some of these they were dangerous situations, and sometimes when things got really hairy, you basically take yourself out to a safer place if you can. If you can't, you just keep working. You're there already. I think what motivates me is the same thing that would motivate me to do any story. It's something that's compelling, something that needs to be told, and this is what I do. This, it sounds like it's a simple answer for me. I don't know if that's satisfying for you, but I mean, this is basically what journalism is about. It's recording and documenting history on a daily basis, and sometimes it's not pretty. Yes, over there.
Yeah, I'm just looking at these photographs, and do you think as a photographer you have the opportunity to become more personal with the people than opposed to other forms of journalism, such as TV or something? Do you think you have more of an opportunity to really get to know people, or do you think it's about the same? It just looks very personal and inside these people's lives.
It depends again on the assignment and on the time you have to work on it. I think that working as a photographer, you're less obtrusive than when you're a television crew. You know, TV doesn't often go with somebody with just one small camera. You have somebody doing sound, you have a producer, you have a reporter. So often a TV crew can be a big thing. Working as a still photographer, you can take one camera and be a little bit less obtrusive, which is one way to get a level of intimacy. The other thing really is time and interest. Most people, if you show genuine interest, will respond to it, especially if they feel like they have something to say. Reporters very often don't like to work with photographers because they even feel that one photographer is intrusive. So it's just a balance, and it depends on, you know, reporters and photographers have to find good relationships to do that. And sometimes being a photographer by yourself works perfectly well too. Yes.
I guess this is a two-part. First part would be, do you feel like you have any kind of emotional, long-term burden from the things you've seen and done? And the second part would be, being on the road so much must hurt your personal life. Is it worth it?
I always get this question. Yes, you carry a lot with you, of course, because in order to make a compelling photograph, I think you have to somehow feel it. You have to absorb the pain that you're witnessing in order to convey it. There's a translation process that happens in photography. You see something and you translate it into a square that's composed well, that has all the information, and that has the power to make the viewer feel it as well. So you become some kind of a conduit. So yes, I think you carry that with you, but you also there's also a professional element to it where you're able to do that and know where to put it at the end of the day. In terms of personal life, yes, it takes a toll on your personal life, but these are all choices that we make, and I'm not unhappy with my choices. I do give up a lot of family events because I've spent New Year's Eve in Sarajevo, I've spent New Year's Eve in Haiti, I've spent Christmases in Tuzla, Bosnia. You know, but those are wonderful experiences on their own. You do give up a mainstream routine, but it's a choice you make, and it's also a choice I'm comfortable with. So let's go over there, maybe. How about you? There. Yeah, please.
Do you feel that any of your photographs have been misconstrued when they've been placed in magazines or newspapers? Like you have a certain effect you're trying to achieve, but when they write the story, when they put it up, it's not what you wanted it to be?
Not usually. I mean, I feel pretty safe with the New York Times. I feel safe with our copy editors and editors. I don't feel like anything is in bad hands there once it leaves my computer. And generally, I don't have a problem with it. Unfortunately, the Palestinian-Israeli story is one that there are such intense emotions on both sides that it's almost like you can't win with that story. Especially in 2002, we actually the Times had a boycott against it by Jewish groups because they felt we were being pro-Palestinian. And then I've heard Palestinians say, then they said it to me, the Times is pro-Israeli. So you just can't win. And I think the way I reconcile that is I figure if nobody's happy, we must be doing something right. So, yes, how about you?
That last picture is gone now, but in situations like that where it seems like in situations like this one, it seems like a very personal moment. How do you get in there? Is that posed? Or
No, that's a good question. And no, I'm pretty much a purist about photography, and that's one of the things I was touching on ethics and photojournalism about believing in the image. Our policy of photojournalism is nothing will be staged, and photographers do get fired for that, by the way, and they have in high-profile papers in recent years. There have been a few incidents. This is not a staged moment. I got to this house very early in the morning with the reporter, and we saw that the family was packing up, and we asked them, could we come in and talk to them for a few minutes? And we had been here probably about 2 hours before this actually happened. They were packing up their boxes, they were moving furniture out, there was a moving van outside, And they didn't mind us being there. They were very practical about the whole situation. They were not going to resist. They were going to go, but they felt that they didn't mind telling their story. So after 2 hours of being there, they knew I was there. They were comfortable with that. And when this gentleman went into the back room to say his final prayer, I just went in very quietly at the end and started taking pictures, and this sort of fortuitous moment happened. So you just have to be ready, you just have to sort of, it's having sort of developing a radar and an anticipation of what's going to happen and being in the right place at the right time for it. Yes?
It sounds like you've been able to do a lot more. It sounds like you've been able to do a lot more long-term coverage. And I was just wondering, from what you've experienced, what you've seen, is what we read in the newspaper or see on the news, is that fairly accurate as to what's actually going on?
Are you talking about some specific story?
No, just in general.
In general? Well, I think that's our goal. I think that is every quality journalist's goal, is to show you, to record, to document faithfully and truthfully what's in front of them and what they're seeing without bias. I think that, to be a professional, you have to do that. I may have a certain opinion, but I may photograph somebody that I don't like, but I'm not going to try to make them look bad in that photograph, if that answers your question, because that just wouldn't be fair, and that wouldn't be truthful. That would be my opinion. So, you have to be very conscious of that as a journalist. And I think it's a question I'm sure this is going to be a hard one.
Just a follow-up on an earlier question. The nature of your job is to take pictures of people in some of the most intimate moments in their life, some of the most emotional.
Mm-hmm.
For you, is there ever an image that you wouldn't wish to be published, that you feel like has crossed the line, that is too intimate, too personal? And the flip side of that, are there times where you've taken images that the subject wishes that you hadn't taken, is asked not to be published?
If somebody asks me not to take a picture, unless it's, I'm going to say, I'm going to respect that. If there is a situation, let's say it's a criminal who's during a perp walk, they may not want their picture taken, but at that point, I think it's out of their hands. Celebrities, although we're not celebrity photographers or paparazzi in any way, I think certain people put themselves in the public eye and may not always want to be photographed, but they've placed themselves in that arena. There are photographs that are difficult to take, and in fact, the one photograph I showed you of the woman with her dead husband, for a moment in that situation I actually froze, and that doesn't often happen to me, but I felt like it was such an intensely personal moment for her. There was all this celebration going around her, and she had to find her dead husband at that moment, and it just seemed so incredibly horrifying to me. And I was not that far from her. I was probably as far as you are to me. But in that split second, what went through my head was this is really what war is about, and this is one of those moments that shows that. So it was important to take that picture, although it was painful to take it. And she wasn't even aware of me being there at that time. She may not have wanted that picture taken. There was no time to ask her. But it was just one of those moments that had to be recorded, and so. Yes. When that woman in Tokyo wrote to me a year later and said, "You don't remember me, but we saw your slideshow and my church raised that money." That's one of those golden moments, and if there's only a few of them in my whole career, I'll be more than happy. But that's the aim. You do it because it's something you want people to see the world around them. You want them to be engaged. I think it's really important for people to be engaged in the world around them. We can't live with our heads in the sand. We're part of a global community, and I think it's very discouraging to me when people don't care about anything beyond their front yard. I think that newspapers are using less and less international news, and people are really tuning out. And what I said before is what I don't understand is why then they go to the local movie theater and look for that very thing. So if anyone here has an answer, I'd like to hear it. Yes.
I'm trying to think of a way to frame this as a question, but maybe just your comment on it. You talked about the oversaturation of news media, and I was noticing just the other night watching the news with my wife, and it was the local news, and it was TV news, that I find that I become a filter that I hear a story and I think, is this sensationalism or is it really a story?
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems like there's so much news media out there that they have to somehow make a living and put themselves ahead of everybody else. And it just seems like a lot of sensationalism. It's really not a story, but they're trying to pump it into one. And I'm not accusing you of that by any means, but it seems like there's a very few amount of reporters or news that really is important news. The rest of it is 24 hours. They've got to do something like on the street.
I agree. I mean, I really do agree. I think that's a problem. We're going more towards entertainment than we are towards what's really important out there. But it's a catch-22. I mean, people don't necessarily want to hear the hard news either. So a lot of times you find news organizations looking for something softer or cheesier or easier or, fluffier or sensationalizing something. They think so. It is a problem. And I agree with you. And I think it's also like people need to demand more of their news organizations.
How do you do that?
I don't know. Write to the president of CBS and say you want another 60 Minutes, or you want Nightline, or you want more NPR style stories or more in-depth reports. I mean we get that from our readers all the time. You'd be amazed at the amount of emails that people send to the New York Times. And it's great. You have a great interaction with your audience. So, yes. Oh, over there, I'm sorry, on the floor.
You said that you spent 2 hours in the house before you got your picture of the man who was praying. How many pictures as a percentage of what you take are actually pictures that you would submit for publication?
Okay.
Does it generally take you hours to get a good picture that you like?
Sometimes it takes days. I mean, everything depends. Sometimes you walk into a situation and it's there, and boom, you've got your first picture is the best picture. Sometimes you'll work a situation and you feel like you don't have it. Moments like that one you can't make them happen, so you have to sit and wait, and you have to be patient. And patience is a key tool to have. How many pictures do I take? Lots and lots and lots. I mean, there was a rule of thumb that we used to go by when we were all shooting film, and I remember a photojournalism professor saying, if you get 1 or 2 good images on a roll of 36 frames, you're doing really well. But I always think about when I'm photographing, I think of it, my camera is my notepad. And every time I click the shutter, I'm making a note, like a reporter is writing notes in his notebook. And you take a lot of notes until you really hit that perfect quote or that perfect crystallized moment. So for me, the process of photography is a physical one. As I'm shooting, I'm also thinking and processing and feeling, rather than just standing there and watching instead of taking the picture. I'm working an angle and so on. So I'm certain did you want to? Let's take one more question. And I think, okay, how about? That's a good question. I think that any journalist, I think most journalists who've been in conflict situations have been faced with situations where somebody needed help or somebody was hurt or and I think that you help when you can help. I was in a very tricky situation in a mosque in Nablus in 2002 during the Israeli incursion into Nablus, and there had been heavy fighting between the Islamic militants and the Israeli army, and the mosque had become their headquarters, and there were at least 15 bodies in there, dead bodies of men who had been killed, and there were several severely wounded men who were very close to death. And we managed to get into the mosque to see what was happening in there. And it was pretty dicey, and we couldn't stay very long. It was quite dangerous to be there. And as we were leaving, one of the Palestinians started screaming at us, "Take him out with you. You have to take them out. They're going to die if you leave them here." And that was an ethical quandary for us because there was no guarantee that we would have gotten any of them out alive. We would have put ourselves in danger as well as putting them in danger. And it would have been probably somehow, it would have been impossible to do, actually. But you couldn't walk out of there with a clear conscience either.